I am delighted to introduce Oli Pescott from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Oli is a plant ecologist at UKCEH, and his main focus is on the contribution of citizen science to ecological understanding of environmental change, and he recently co-edited the latest atlas of the British and Irish Flora's Plant Atlas 2020. Oli will be telling us more about what insights we can gain from NPMS data. So I'll hand over to you, Oli. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jasmine, for that introduction. Yes, I'll be giving a broad overview of the data collection process, the information that we gain from all those wonderful field visits and what they have been translating into to date at the national level. I'll just say from a personal point of view, it's been really nice to hear all these reminiscences about the origins of the scheme. I started at UKCEH in 2013, and so I was very much involved very closely with the development of the scheme, and it's jogged a lot of memories, and luckily only a couple of those involve cold sweats, so it's all been good. Excellent. Let's progress onto the right screen. I thought I'd start with a bit of a deeper historical dive, just to put where we are now and what such an amazing achievement it is in the context of perhaps one of the greatest achievements of volunteer plant recording internationally, and something that perhaps started the ball rolling that led to the NPMS in a very kind of long-term historical view. That was, of course, the 1962 Plant Atlas. And that didn't have any information about habitat in it. It had these rather bald now, I suppose, plant distribution maps at 10K, which a lot of us will be familiar with. But there were actually aspirations to collect habitat information even at that time, which is not widely appreciated. This is from the UKCEH archives, specifically the Biological Records Centre archives. It's a letter from Hef Warburg, who was a plant ecologist and botanist at the University of Oxford for a long time, corresponding with Max Walters, who was one of the early coordinators of BRC and the Plant Atlas, and he was giving feedback on the habitat guidance that was included on the field cards that were used at that time, and that information was kind of codified and designed to be entered onto the field cards that people were using. But actually, if you go to that 1962 atlas and you read through the fascinating introduction to that work, the habitats are not mentioned anywhere, and in fact, in the end, they weren't used. I don't quite know whether that was because they weren't consistently recorded, but I think, having looked at field cards in our archives, I think a lot of people did enter that information using this codification scheme that I've put a screenshot of here from a later piece of BRC guidance in the 70s. And you can also see from these old-fashioned species cards here, which are kind of single occurrences of plants in the field. This were recorded on these pink cards in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, perhaps even into the 90s as well. And those red arrows there point out where those codes have been used. So this information was collected, and there was a desire to understand these associations, even back in the kind of these big citizen science pushes in the early 50s and 60s. But I think the problem was that it was just too challenging to present that information at the time in those kind of simplified maps that were presented as part of that project. And so all of that information that had been painstakingly collected just has languished in filing cabinets and never really been used. So I just thought it was nice to put that in to show how far we've come from that aspiration to the kind of realized data set that we have now at this point, where we're 10 years into the NPMS. And this table here really shows that, I think. This is from the data that are openly available on the Environmental Information Data Centre, which Chris mentioned earlier, which is a fantastic boon of the scheme. It's just there, all the data, anyone can get it and use it for whatever analyses they want to. These numbers might not correspond exactly to some of the ones you've seen in the annual reports, and that's because whenever it's a kind of embarrassment of riches problem. We have so much data and they're collected across so many different levels. It's always challenging for us to know how to present it to people, and so often we give square counts, maybe about 300 1 kilometre squares visited a year. Sometimes we talk about the actual records. So we've got almost 270,000 individual plant occurrence records. But I thought this measure of plot visits, this is a count of sampling events where somebody goes to a plot on a day, or goes to a square on a day and makes a record of a plot. I thought perhaps that maps onto the actual effort in terms of, Chris mentioned earlier about the effort involved in walking between plots and actually recording the releve and all that kind of stuff. And so almost 26,000, and this is only up to 2024, I should say. It's almost 26,000 plots that people have stood in front of in the wind, in the rain, in the sun, sweating, perhaps because of the heat or perhaps because of the plant identification they're doing and the challenges that throws up. But I thought this is a really nice way of showing that even for some quite rare and unusual habitats at the kind of scale at which we often think about the UK, such as these native pine woods and rock outcrops and things, even at those levels, we've still got almost 200 for pine wood and almost 450 or probably exactly that for this year's data as well. Those are occurrences where people have stood in the field with their clipboards and recorded all of that information. And so I think that's a nice number, that almost 26,000 instances of people poring over their clipboards. And one thing we don't often talk about, partly because we haven't really had the resources or perhaps the expertise as well to really utilize these data. We also have these photos. Every time people go out and record a plot in the field, they try and submit photos of the plot, and often more than one. And so we've actually got almost 15,000 plot photos, which obviously show the condition, other habitat qualities that people are recording, like the height of the vegetation, the shading, and all those types of things. And so I thought I'd put this in as well as an aspiration that going forwards, we'd really like to link that plant cover data, all that habitat attribute data, and of course how they change over time. Or we often present these time series that we'll see later in this presentation. We've seen them earlier. It'd be really nice to kind of connect up some of this visual information with all of that attribute and plant cover information that we're collecting. Some of these and these are now available through the Square details pages to everybody, so it's quite fun. You can kind of dial up any square anywhere and look at how the plots were looking on any particular visit. And so, perhaps the technological leaps we've seen recently in terms of analyzing photos using AI techniques could be something that we're able to look at in the next few years. This is the Square details page. I just wanted to highlight this again. I know. Rachel did mention this, and perhaps it was in somebody else's talk as well, but it's such a nice way of seeing the local effort and helping people to select squares and understanding again the effort that's gone in. So we've got the map here at the top left of a square with the pink blobs. This was one that was surveyed by two people to two sets of different types of plots set up, and the summaries of the species, number of visits, what level they were. This plot is actually interactive on the website, and you can click on the bars and see what levels different things are recorded at. But I think again, it just gives us an insight, being able to scroll through these photos and also see the little sketch maps that people contributed if they scan them and associated with them with the plot on the website. Those are also viewable through this interface. So just to highlight, there's a kind of, you can go for a journey through the landscape of the UK at such a fine scale and in a way that's actually focused on vegetation. I know there are other kind of semi-citizen science websites out there like Geograph where people take photos of the landscape in a kind of ordnance survey type way, but obviously no one apart from the NPMS is looking at the level of vegetation and focusing in on the plants. And obviously as ecologists and conservationists, that's the kind of level of detail that we need if we're to connect the kind of analytical outputs that we might garner or academics might produce, and to link them to that kind of experience that we have in the field. And that's kind of the jumping off point for the rest of my talk, really, in that we've heard a lot about we've heard some wonderful talks from the volunteers and the volunteer experience, and that's always something that's slightly odd as somebody sitting in the analyst chair doing academic work, but who's also a field recorder and goes out and got into this job because I love sticking my head into a great piece of turf, as Dürer called this etching back in the 16th century, and it's kind of very abstract to then take that and turn it into a dot map, some sort of distribution trend, or more recently these kind of codifications of plant abundance within plots. And it's a kind of a hurdle that we have to get over, I think, often when we're communicating results to volunteers, in that often you want to be there with your head stuck in the vegetation, looking at fine details of plants through the hand lens, but then we kind of boil that down to sometimes quite unemotional plots and presentations. But that's why we've been trying extra hard in the last couple of years with our funding to really bring some of those results alive for people through the website and through the volunteer newsletter as well as we can. There's the link to the trends page, which was only launched last year, at the bottom of that slide. And this is an example of sticky mouse here, Cerastium glomeratum, and it relates to, I think, some anecdotes or comments that Rachel was making in the panel discussion about how we are already starting to see the impacts of extreme weather events come through on our trends at the species level. So Cerastium glomeratum, the sticky mouse, is a species of bare ground, often in grasslands, and those patches appear more when there's been a long dry summer, and you get, obviously you'll know, patches in your lawns, patches in grasslands, and often allows the seeds to germinate and kind of start to develop, and then in the spring it's quite an early flower and early vegetative plant, and that kind of takes advantage of those gaps in the vegetation. And so these peaks and troughs in the trend here that you can, in percentage cover, that you can view on the website, it's possible that they probably do relate to that kind of cycle of gap filling and expansion and retrenchment as different environments happen. And we've been trying to visualize this information at the percentage cover, this plant cover level, more regularly for volunteers. We've done a couple of these in the volunteer newsletter and annual report. This one was for arable field margins. So here, I apologize, we've got scientific names along here, but these are all the positive indicator species for arable margins, and the kind of peaks, the peakiness of these, or these distributions, here, represent the kind of all-time abundance distribution of those species. So it's really great information as it links into things like the National Vegetation Classification, allows us to get robust and excellent evidence what the kind of typical plant cover is for those different species, and in text there on the right, their kind of frequency across plots at that larger scale as well. And so it gives us kind of a benchmark, and also that type of information can also go into analyses that link to pollinators. Percentage cover will have some relationship with the number of flowers, which is then linked to number of pollinators and resources for those. So it's great that we've been able to produce that information and propagate it as well. We put other things in the annual report, things that we don't base current indicators on, but which are nice complementary measures. These were kind of histograms and bar and whisker plots of box and whisker plots of the indicator counts that we have across broad habitats. So again, this is just an overview across all of the different habitats, but even here some interesting patterns come out. For instance, arable margins in pink. On the left we've got positive indicators, on the right we've got negative indicators. So the typical plot that volunteers come across for arable margins has relatively few positive indicator species on average, often none at all, but perhaps one at the best quite frequently. But for negative indicators, most people are recording one or more. So, and equally at the bottom there for native pinewood and juniper scrub, that interestingly shows that although we don't have a large data set there and it is a restricted habitat at the scale of the UK anyway, the plots that are being recorded are quite rich in positive indicator species, suggesting that they are actually in quite good condition. Perhaps they're receiving active management, or perhaps they've just not been affected by extrinsic drivers like climate or nitrogen deposition or whatever it might be. So we've tried to come up with different ways of presenting them. But as I said, we have this kind of embarrassment of riches problem where there's so many things we could possibly codify and present that it becomes a challenge to work out which one we want to do at any given time. I think David in the panel discussion mentioned the very recent, this was in September actually, it was published, the very recent inclusion of the National Plant Monitoring Scheme quadrat plot or relevé set into this GB level national vegetation plot database. And this time series here on the y-axis, we've got number of samples, on the x-axis we've just got time, and this just shows which kind of national initiative quadrat data has come from historically, going back to the 1950s. Grey is just kind of miscellaneous other schemes. The big ones here are back in the 70s when there's a lot of data coming through from National Vegetation Classification surveys, which basically, that doesn't really exist now, although in the same way, of course, consultants and academics and lots of other people use the MVC, but there's no central collation activity for those data. We have spikes in blue, which are very big, where the previous kind of periodic national countryside survey was conducted. That is still going on. You can see smaller bits of blue in the last few years. That's a kind of pared back rolling countryside survey. But you can see in that kind of mustard cover the contribution that the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, this is up to 2023, the data inclusion here, but you can see it's the main contributor over the last 10 years now. So actually, the NPMS can justly say that we are the main source of quadrat data contributing to national monitoring over the last 10 years. And of course, that makes us an important part of this time series going back to the middle of the 20th century as well. And this is available for researchers. So we're likely to see a step change in the use of NPMS data being used for various analyses and presentations in the future. This was one such. This was from 2022, but the work was probably done a little bit earlier than that, probably in 2020. And this was an example of integrating monitoring scheme data across different schemes. So the NPMS is listed here, that rolling countryside survey. Natural England have something called the long-term monitoring network, which mainly focused on NNRs, if not exclusively, and the small environmental change network, which is kind of a small amalgamation of experimental sites. And what they did was they took all of that Quadrat data and turned those plants into kind of indicator scores. So historically, the British native flora, each species has been assigned kind of attributes or indicator values indicating whether that plant likes fertile environments, likes acidic or calcareous, moisture, light, and all those things. And so you can kind of create these weighted metrics for quadrats, and you can say this quadrat, actually, if we take all the plant's indicator scores, it's this on average this fertile. And so we could actually model national maps of these things. So the example here is a map of average plant community fertility, and the NPMS dataset would have made a big contribution to that, and that's available openly again on the Environmental Data Centre for researchers to use alongside all of the other ones. We've heard a little bit about the climate change exposure work that the NPMS led on a couple of years ago, and that was also a way of looking at how well the National Plant Monitoring Scheme was likely to perform in its core task of monitoring the environment, with climate change being perhaps the main external driver, one of the top 2 or 3 drivers of environmental change in the past, but also to the future as well. And my colleague Ollie Wilson came up with a metric of climate change exposure, or we did together, which basically amalgamates all of the different, a number of different precipitation and temperature metrics and turns them into a single score. So darker colors on these, more intense colors, so through blue to green to yellow to red to pink to kind of a almost white heat. These colors indicate the transition of any given 1 kilometer square in this climate change exposure space over these time periods, these comparisons that are giving here for this maps. And so between from now to 2061 to 2080 on the bottom right, you can see a large swathe of the English lowlands and Midlands will be experiencing quite a large measure of climate change exposure. So you thought it's important to understand how the NPMS was set up to monitor this anticipated change in the local environment of our 1 kilometre squares. And what we found was that the NPMS, we looked at a number of other schemes as well, as I said, those ones that I mentioned before for that fertility plot. We looked at how well our national schemes and the coverage within those schemes, so all of your plots that you've gone out and reported data on, how well those locations actually covered these exposure gradients. And the message was that different schemes did different things well, but the NPMS showed excellent coverage of quite a number of quite important habitats. So I've just picked on 4 individual ones here. There's quite a lot of information in these plots, but I'll just focus for the moment on the top left, the broadleaf woodland. The bottom field distribution or density is the kind of national distribution of woodland or broadleaf woodland in total, and its distribution across that climate change gradient. So it's because broadleaf woodland is common across the UK, it covers most of that big gradient. And the other lines above basically show how well the other monitoring schemes cover that gradient. And the purple one in the NPMS purple shows quite a close fit to the national distribution of broadleaf woodland, and you can see that number there, 70%. That was an estimate of how well it actually kind of filled that density, that national distribution space. So the countryside survey there did slightly better, but you can see that the NPMS was doing excellently at showing us that those plots where they are now, where volunteers have set them up already, where we're getting data, that actually is a very good representative sample of climate change exposure in woodland. So we could be quite confident that when we're analysing broadleaf woodland plots and data, that if there is a climate change signal, then we're quite likely to be able to see it. Calcareous grassland NPMS did extremely well. That's because our scheme was specifically designed to focus on semi-natural habitats. So you can see there, calcareous grassland nationally is bimodal. It has 2 peaks. That might be the Breadalbane Mountains in the north and the kind of southern chalk as well. I can't remember exactly how that factors, but the NPMS distribution mimics it very well, and it's got quite a high score for coverage. Likewise, the 2 bottom ones are quite similar. we did excellently at covering suburban land cover. So that might be important for lots of habitats that are adjacent to suburban, like woodlands on the edges of cities, urban nature reserves, that type of thing, and salt marsh as well. So I think it just shows, even though there are these biases in where people live and where people are able to survey, actually for certain things we are doing extremely well. So finally, I'll just end up by talking about what we've heard a little bit about at all, and that's a little bit about already, sorry, which was this desire, and perhaps one of the founding desires of the NPMS, to report on national habitat quality. And this is one of those situations that goes back to my slide earlier, where we've got our head stuck in this beautiful turf in the field on a beautiful day, and having this thrill of identifying all the species that we love to learn about and recognize. And then the data gets crunched up and it gets turned into a black and white line on a graph. And there's something, it's obviously a kind of rather extreme abstraction of all that effort that goes into the work in the field. And so sometimes it feels a little bit alien, but these lines are very important for helping us to understand some sort of average state of nature. And obviously it's those types of bits of information that can be distilled down, and those nuggets given to policymakers and academics and others who are seeking to understand our natural environment. So it is a kind of, whilst it is a brutal process of reducing that colour and richness and mosaic into particularly in this example where I've used a fetching grey colour scheme, it is important for the work we do. This just shows these 4 broad habitats are the best surveyed in the NPMS, and this is really a starting point for these national indicators. This plants of the wider countryside one, where the indicator is the average percentage cover of the positive indicator species that are assigned for those at the broad habitat level. And so you can see across the board, actually, we broadleaf woodland and hedges, lowland grassland, arable margins, they're actually typically a pretty good representation of where those habitats actually are in the UK. Obviously, we can't sample arable where it doesn't exist, but if we think of it in terms of that climate change exposure plots that we saw, we're probably doing pretty well in sampling the national gradient of these things. Bog and wet heath, there are some gaps in places. Probably we don't have any plots currently from the Outer Hebrides, and very few in the Northern Isles, but on the whole, we're reasonably confident that actually we can represent the main stocks of those habitats across the UK, and that's why we've got those national indicators. And these are the current indicators. As I think a couple of people mentioned already, they are still in development, which means we're still learning about the methods that we're using, because we are using quite cutting edge approaches to produce these indicators in terms of the complexity of the model that tries to take into account false absences where people might miss plants on a visit within a year, and missing data where plots aren't visited in a given year, and we have to kind of fill in all those gaps and smooth over them. So they're quite complex, but this is where we are at the moment, and we have this UK one already on the UK Biodiversity Indicators website, but we have also prepared England level ones in the same format, which I think are going to be released later in the autumn or early winter. And separately to this, we're also contributing data to a separate England level indicator, which is the plant all species abundance indicator, which links to the Environment Act 2021. And that act comes with particular targets that the government is committed to for 2030 and things like that. So NPMS data are also contributing to different indicators aside of these, alongside the abundances of birds and butterflies and other groups which were mentioned by Chris in her talk. So these are quickly becoming a very important resource for the UK community and in understanding environmental change. I'll very quickly, as my last slide, just go over some very other quick uses, because I guess the problem with this topic area is there's so much that has happened, and a lot of it's quite technical, and each of the topics probably requires a full talk on its own. So this is going to be a very superficial run through, but they have been used, the NPMS data have been used to look at the effects of agri-environment schemes as primarily as a counterfactual. So we've got all these plots on farmland where farmers are known to be implementing agri-environment scheme measures, and in some cases we have the spatial distribution of that, so then we can use the NPMS data to identify places where those stewardship measures aren't being used currently and see whether there's any difference. And there's another piece of work going on currently at UKCEH with other partners on that topic. They've also been used to look at how brownfield sites support biodiversity. I've highlighted this already. They're an important resource for updating models of plant communities. So one of the applications of that Quadrat repository that I mentioned earlier, that the NPMS is a massive contributor to, is to update the National Vegetation Classification, because that's primarily based on data collected quite a long time ago now. The NPMS plots have also been used to ground truth AI-based plant community predictions in an international competition. And separate to that, a couple of people have mentioned like 300 studies that have used NPMS data. I think that might be an old number, because that we also share the plant occurrence records with the NBN, and that from there it goes to something called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, separate website, and we can track the use of the data via that website. And currently, as of yesterday, there are 656 studies that had cited the NPMS data set. And that's probably an underestimate, because that assumes that people have actually remembered to go through the kind of process of getting a citation for the data set and accurately listing it. So that's probably an underestimate as well. So yeah, the data are having both local and international impacts. So yeah, thank you for listening. And thank you to everyone, obviously.